The wrong frequency at 1:16 a.m. on June 6, 1944. A single decision inside a freezing aircraft would change the course of the D-Day invasion. Somewhere over the English Channel, in total darkness, Staff Sergeant Thomas Whitaker sat inside the radio compartment of a C-47 transport plane, listening to the constant hum of the engines and the distant echo of anti-aircraft fire ahead. The sky outside was pitch black, with no moon and no horizon, only occasional flashes of orange explosions lighting up the clouds. He checked his watch. They were 30 miles from the Normandy coast, just minutes away from the drop zone. Behind him, 127 paratroopers sat packed tightly together, silent and focused, their faces painted black, weapons strapped to their legs, waiting for the moment they would be told to jump into the unknown. Whitaker adjusted his headset as static crackled in his ears. Then the pilot's voice broke through, calm but urgent. Radio, confirm pathfinder signal. Whitaker leaned forward toward his console. His job was simple: locate the pathfinder beacon, confirm their position, and tell the pilot exactly when they reached the drop zone. He had done it 17 times in training without a single mistake. Reaching for the frequency dial, he tuned it to 38.7 megahertz, the assigned frequency for drop zone A. Then he looked at the signal lights in front of him, and something immediately felt wrong. The green light blinked once, then stopped, then blinked again in an irregular pattern. It wasn't steady, it wasn't what he had trained for. In every rehearsal, the signal had been perfect, 1 pulse per second, consistent, reliable. But this was different, this was chaotic. Whitaker leaned closer, his brow tightening. The green light flickered twice, paused, then blinked 3 times before going completely dark. He checked the antenna connection, it was secure. He tapped the console lightly, hoping it was just a loose connection. Pulses, then nothing. His stomach tightened as he realized something was seriously wrong. Behind him, the cargo door suddenly opened, and a violent rush of freezing air tore through the plane. The temperature dropped instantly. The paratroopers stood up, hooking themselves to their static lines, preparing for the jump. They couldn't hear the radio. They couldn't see the signal. The only thing they depended on was Whitaker. He was the one who would tell the pilot when they were over the drop zone, and right now he didn't know. The pilot's voice came through again, sharper this time. Radio, confirm signal. Are we on course? Whitaker swallowed hard. His mouth was dry and he could taste metal. His training manual had been clear. If the beacon malfunctioned, abort the drop, circle back, and wait for orders. It was the safe and correct procedure, but nothing about this night was safe. Whitaker glanced out the small window and saw flak bursting in the distance, growing closer with air. Second, German anti-aircraft guns were already firing at them. If they stayed on course, they would fly straight into it. If they turned back, they risked colliding with the second wave, hundreds of planes flying in darkness without lights. There was no margin for error. His hands trembled slightly as he looked back at the console. The yellow light flickered briefly, then the red light flashed once before both went completely dark. The signal was gone. They were flying blind. Radio, I need confirmation, the pilot said. Urgency now clear in his voice. Are we on course? Whitaker stared at the transmit button. He had 2 choices: tell the truth and abort the mission, risking the entire operation, or make a decision and trust his instincts. He hesitated for a moment, then looked back at the console and noticed something he had never seen before. Beneath the main frequency dial was a smaller, almost hidden selector. He leaned closer to read the tiny stenciled letters next to it. Out! 42.1. Whitaker blinked. An alternate frequency? His training had never mentioned this, not once. He checked the main frequency again, 38.7, still dead. Then he looked back at the alternate marking. It made sense. Every system had backups. Every mission had redundancy. Maybe this was it, the fallback frequency, with nothing left to lose. Whitaker reached out and slowly turned the dial to 42.1 megahertz. He held his breath. Then suddenly the green light came alive, bright, steady, perfect. 1 pulse per second, exactly like it had been in training. Whitaker exhaled in relief. The yellow light came on moments later, indicating they were approaching the drop zone. Everything was working again. Everything felt right. He grabbed the transmit button and spoke quickly. Pilot, confirm pathfinder signal. Green and steady. We're on course. The pilot responded immediately, without hesitation. Copy that. 2 minutes to drop. Whitaker leaned back slightly, his hands finally steady. He had saved the mission. Behind him, the paratroopers adjusted their gear and moved into position. Everything was back on track. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. The signal Whitaker had just locked onto was not coming from Drop Zone A. It was coming from Drop Zone C 6 miles to the south, deep inside enemy territory, directly in the path of German defenses. And no one on that plane had any idea. As the aircraft pushed forward, flak bursts lit up the sky around them. The plane shook slightly as the pilot adjusted course. Whitaker checked his watch again, 1:19 a.m. right on schedule. He looked at the console. The signal was still strong, still steady, still unmistakable. To him, it meant they were exactly where they needed to be. But on the ground, a very different reality was unfolding. 30 minutes earlier, Pathfinder teams had jumped ahead of the main force. Their mission was to land first, set up radio beacons, and guide the incoming aircraft. It was a simple plan, but it had already begun to fail. Strong winds scattered the teams across the countryside. Thick clouds blocked visibility. Some paratroopers landed miles from their intended zones. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others were captured immediately upon landing. Out of 18 Pathfinder teams, only a few reached their correct positions. One team, assigned to Drop Zone C, was blown completely off course. Only one man survived the landing. Alone, disoriented, and surrounded by enemy territory, he still managed to complete his mission. He set up the beacon exactly as trained, but in the wrong location, nearly half a mile from the intended drop zone, deep in hostile ground. That misplaced signal was now broadcasting into the night, and it was the signal Whitaker had locked on to. Back in the aircraft, the red light on Whitaker's console flak. The jumpmaster stood at the open door as wind roared through the fuselage. The paratroopers lined up, each one connected to the static line, each one ready to step into darkness. Whitaker pressed the transmit button one final time. "Pilot, we're over the drop zone." The pilot responded instantly. "Copy, stand by." The jumpmaster raised his hand. 5 seconds. Whitaker stared at the console. Green, yellow, red. Everything looked perfect. Everything was working exactly as it should, but it was all wrong, and in just a few seconds, 127 men would jump into the wrong place, changing the course of the night in ways no one could have predicted. The wrong drop at 1:21 a.m., the first paratrooper stepped into the darkness. There was no hesitation, no second thought, just a firm slap on the shoulder from the jump master, and he was gone, swallowed instantly by the black sky below. One by one, the rest followed. In less than 10 seconds, all 127 men disappeared into the night, their parachutes snapping open above a landscape none of them could see. Inside the C-47, the sudden silence felt almost unnecessary. The plane grew lighter, rising slightly as the last man exited. The pilot banked away, turning back toward England, confident the mission had been executed perfectly. Behind them, drifting slowly toward the ground, the paratroopers had no idea they were 6 miles off target. Private First Class Daniel Kowalski felt the jolt as his parachute deployed. For a brief moment, there was peace, just the sound of wind rushing past his ears, and the faint hum of distant engines fading away. Then reality returned. Tracer fire streaked across the sky in the distance, thin lines of red and orange cutting through the darkness. He tried to orient himself, but there was nothing to see. No landmarks, no lights, no signals from the ground, just endless black beneath him. His boots hit the ground hard. He rolled instinctively, training taking over, quickly pulling himself free from the tangled parachute. He lay still for a moment, listening. The night was eerily quiet, just the sound of wind moving hedgerows and the distant rumble of engines somewhere far away. Kowalski reached for his compass, flipping it open with shaking hands. He checked the direction, then checked it again. It didn't make sense. According to his orders, he should have landed east of the Murderate River, near a rally point marked by Pathfinder lights. But there were no lights, no signals, no voices calling out, only darkness. He pulled out his map, shielding a small flashlight with his hand to avoid detection. Slowly, carefully, he studied the terrain, the shape of the fields, the position of the hedgerows, the faint outline of a road in the distance. Then it hit him. His stomach dropped. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. Not even close. He was miles south of the drop zone. Then he heard it, the low rumble of engines growing louder. Kowalski immediately dropped flat into the grass, pressing himself against the earth. Moments later, the first truck rolled past on a nearby road, no more than 30 yards away. Its engine growled steadily, the silhouette barely visible in the darkness. Then another followed, and another, a convoy. German, moving north fast. Kowalski stayed perfectly still, counting the seconds between each vehicle. These weren't random patrols. This was organized movement troops or supplies heading straight toward the invasion beaches. After the last truck passed, Kowalski waited, counting slowly to 30 before moving. He crawled toward a nearby hedgerow, keeping low, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when he saw them two figures crouched in a ditch just ahead. He froze, raising his rifle. One of them whispered urgently, "Don't shoot!" American. Relief washed over him as he moved closer. Neither of them were from his unit. One belonged to the 506th, the other to the 501st. Different regiments, same confusion, same problem. None of them knew exactly where they were. "Where the hell are we?" one of them asked quietly. "South," Kowalski replied. "Maybe 6 miles off." The words hung in the air for a moment. 6 miles might as well have been 100 in enemy territory. Then the sound of engines returned more trucks, this time from the opposite direction. The three men pressed deeper into the ditch as the convoy passed. 5 trucks this time, maybe more behind them, all moving fast, all heading north. That's when Kowalski understood. They hadn't just landed in the wrong place, they had landed on something important. This road wasn't random, it was a supply route. A main artery feeding German forces toward the beaches. Every truck, every soldier, every piece of equipment moving along this road was heading straight into the fight that was about to explode at dawn. If those reinforcements reached the coast in time, the landings could turn into a massacre. Kowalski looked at the 2 men beside him. "We need to stop them." The other soldier shook his head slightly. "There's 3 of us." "I know," Kowalski said quietly, "but they don't know that." Before either of them could respond, movement appeared in the darkness. More figures emerging from the fields. Paratroopers, scattered, disoriented, but alive. Within minutes, more joined them, 4 from the 502nd, 3 from another unit, 2 more who had landed even farther off course. None of them belonged together, but that didn't matter anymore. By 1:45 a.m., Kowalski had 19 men with him. 19 soldiers who were never supposed to be here. One of them, a sergeant, carried a bazooka. Another had a satchel charge. Someone else dragged a Bangalore torpedo through the grass. Heavy weapons meant for specific objectives miles away, but those objectives no longer mattered. The road in front of them mattered, the trucks mattered, the timing mattered. Kowalski watched another convoy approach, the faint rumble echoing through the fields. He didn't have orders, he didn't have a plan from command, but he didn't need one. He made the decision. We hit them. Move quickly, taking positions along both sides of the road. 9 men on the north side, 10 on the south. The bazooka team positioned themselves behind a low stone wall, giving them a clear angle at the approaching vehicles. The rest spread out along the hedgerows, rifles ready, grenades in hand. The plan was simple: wait for the first shot, then unleash everything they had. The sound of engines grew louder. The first truck appeared around the bend, moving slowly, cautiously, its dark shape barely visible against the night. Kowalski steadied his breathing. Every second stretched longer. The truck rolled closer, 20 yards, 15 teen. The bazooka fired. The rocket slammed into the engine block of the lead truck, erupting in a flash of fire and metal. The vehicle lurched violently, skidding sideways as flames burst from beneath the hood. Soldiers inside shouted in confusion, scrambling to get out. Before they could react, gunfire erupted from both sides of the road. Rifles cracked in rapid succession, muzzle flashes lighting up the hedgerows. The second truck slammed into the first, unable to stop in time. More soldiers poured out, disoriented, firing blindly into the darkness. They had no idea how many Americans were attacking them. They had no idea where the fire was coming from. They only knew they were under attack. A paratrooper sprinted forward and threw a satchel charge beneath a third truck before diving back into cover. The explosion lifted the vehicle off the ground, destroying it instantly. Another team detonated the Bangalore torpedo as a 4th truck tried to turn around, flipping it onto its side. Chaos spread instantly through the convoy. Some German soldiers ran. Others tried to fight. None of them could coordinate. The entire ambush lasted less than 5 minutes. Then it was over. Smoke drifted across the road. Flames burned from the wreckage. The night fell silent again. Kowalski scanned the area, his heart still pounding. 4 trucks destroyed, 2 more disabled, dozens of enemy soldiers dead, wounded, or scattered. And not a single American casualty. "Move," he whispered. Within seconds, the group disappeared back into the hedgerows, vanishing into the darkness before reinforcements could arrive. What none of them realized in that moment was how significant this was. They hadn't just survived, they had disrupted a critical supply route. And they wouldn't be the only ones. Across the countryside, hundreds of scattered paratroopers were landing in the wrong places, lost, disoriented, cut off from their units. But instead of regrouping, many of them were doing exactly what Kowalski had just done. Small groups, independent actions, ambushes, sabotage, confusion. To the Germans, it didn't look like scattered units. It looked like a massive airborne invasion behind their lines. And the deeper the confusion spread, the more it would change everything. The illusion of an army. By 2:15 a.m., the night had turned against Germans, and they didn't even realize why. Reports began flooding into command posts across Normandy, each one more confusing than the last. American paratroopers spotted behind the lines, small groups attacking convoys, roads cut, communications disrupted, but none of the reports matched. Some officers claimed they were facing dozens of enemy soldiers. Others swore it was hundreds. A few insisted entire airborne divisions had landed miles inland. There was no pattern, no clear objective, no single direction of attack. Whose chouse? Inside a dimly lit headquarters, German officers leaned over maps, trying to make sense of it. Telephone lines buzzed constantly. Radios crackled with overlapping messages. Every few minutes, a new report arrived, another ambush, another sighting, another request for reinforcements. The officers marked positions on their maps, but the more they added, the worse it looked. The Americans weren't concentrated in one area, they were everywhere. Problem. Because if the Americans were everywhere, then where was the main attack? Along the road south of Sainte-Mère-Église, Kowalski and his small group of paratroopers continued moving through the hedgerows. The adrenaline from the ambush hadn't faded yet, but now it was mixed with something else, momentum. They weren't lost anymore, they had a purpose. Every truck they stopped, every delay they caused, bought time for the invasion force moving toward the beaches. More scattered paratroopers joined them as the night went on. Some came alone. Others arrived in pairs or small groups, drawn by the sound of explosions or gunfire. None of them had orders. None of them knew the full picture. But instinctively, they all made the same decision: fight where you land. By 3:00 a.m., there were multiple groups like Kowalski's operating along the same road. Some set up ambushes, others cut communication lines, a few attacked isolated German patrols. Each action was small on its own, but together they created something far bigger than anyone had planned. To the Germans, it felt like they were under attack from a coordinated force spreading across the entire region. Messages reached divisional headquarters with increasing urgency. American paratroopers reported at key intersections, supply routes compromised, convoys destroyed, units requesting immediate support. The response was instinctive: send troops inland, secure the roads, eliminate the threat. But that decision came with a cost. Every soldier sent away from the coast was one less defending the beaches. Every truck turned around was one less reinforcing the front line. Every minute spent chasing scattered paratroopers was a minute the invasion force grew stronger. In the confusion, German commanders made a critical mistake. They assumed the airborne drops were the main assault, or at least a major part of it. The idea that small, scattered groups could create this level of disruption seemed impossible, so they prepared something much larger. Entire units were redirected inland. Orders were issued to hunt down and destroy the paratroopers before they could organize, but there was nothing to organize. That was the illusion. The Americans weren't forming up, they weren't regrouping, they weren't following a coordinated plan. They were simply reacting, improvising, adapting, and that made them unpredictable. Back near the road, Kowalski's group prepared for another ambush. The wreckage from the previous attack still smoldered faintly, casting a dim glow across the fields. They had moved slightly north, choosing a new position along a narrow stretch of road bordered by thick hedgerows. The terrain worked in their favor: limited visibility, tight space, no room for the enemy to maneuver. The sound of engines returned once again, more trucks. This time the convoy was larger. Kowalski counted at least 6 vehicles, moving cautiously now, as if the Germans were expecting trouble. The first truck slowed as it approached the wreckage ahead. Soldiers inside were alert, scanning the darkness. They knew something had happened here, they just didn't know what. Kowalski raised his hand, signaling his men to hold. White, closer, closer. The lead truck rolled to a near stop. That's when the attack began. Rifles cracked from both sides of the road. Grenades exploded beneath the vehicles. One truck caught fire instantly, flames spreading under the canvas cover. German soldiers jumped out, firing into the hedgerows, but they couldn't see their targets. The Americans stayed low, hidden behind thick vegetation, firing in short, controlled bursts. Another satchel charge detonated, disabling a second truck. The convoy tried to pull back, but there was no room to turn around. Vehicles collided, engines roared. Orders were shouted in confusion. Within moments, the entire road was blocked. Again, the fight was fast, unpredictable, and then it was over. The paratroopers disappeared once more into darkness, leaving behind destruction and more uncertainty. Farther north, similar scenes played out again and again. Small groups of paratroopers attacking isolated targets, vanishing before the Germans could respond. Each attack forced the enemy to slow down, to question, to hesitate. And hesitation in war can be as powerful as any weapon. By 4:00 a.m., German command was struggling to maintain control. Reports from the field were contradictory and incomplete. Some units reported heavy resistance, others encountered nothing at all. The roads were no longer safe. Movement became cautious, deliberate, slower. And time was exactly what the Allies needed, because out at sea, beyond the darkness, the largest invasion force in history was already moving toward the coasts of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, all depending on one thing: time. Back in the air, long after the drop, Whitaker's plane had already returned to England. The crew believed the mission had been a success. Clean drop, on target, no major issues. Whitaker himself felt a quiet sense of relief. He had faced a problem, found a solution, and completed his job. That was all that mattered. He had no idea what was happening on the ground, no idea that the signal he followed had sent those men into a completely different battle. No idea that his decision had scattered them into the exact place where they could cause the most disruption. And no idea that, at that very moment, German forces were being pulled away from the beaches, drawn inland by an invisible threat that didn't actually exist. As the first light of dawn began to approach, the situation across Normandy had shifted completely. What started as confusion was turning into something far more dangerous for the Germans. Fear, because they still didn't know the truth. They didn't know how many paratroopers had landed, they didn't know where the main objective was, and they didn't know where the next attack would come from. It felt like the Americans were everywhere, an entire army hidden in the darkness. The collapse of control by 4:30 a.m. The situation behind the German lines had reached a breaking point. What began as scattered reports of isolated paratroopers had turned into a full-scale crisis of confidence. Commanders no longer trusted the information coming in. Every message contradicted the last. One unit reported a small American force hiding in hedgerows. Another claimed an entire battalion was advancing across open fields. Some officers insisted the attacks were random. Others believed they were coordinated strikes designed to cut off reinforcements. The truth was far simpler and far more dangerous. No one knew what was actually happening. Inside German headquarters, maps were now covered in markings. Red circles, arrows, notes scribbled in urgency. The more they tried to make sense of it, the worse it looked. The American presence wasn't concentrated. It was scattered across a wide area, striking unpredictably. To the officers studying the situation, it didn't look like chaos. It looked like a deliberate strategy. A massive airborne assault designed to cripple their response before the main invasion even began, so they reacted the only way they knew how. They committed more forces inland. Entire companies were ordered off defensive positions near the coast and redirected toward the interior. Convoys that should have been heading north toward the beaches were halted, turned around, or rerouted to hunt down paratroopers. Communication lines were prioritized for internal security rather than coastal defense. Every decision made sense in isolation, but together they created a dangerous gap where it mattered most. The beaches. Along the roads south of Sainte-Mère-Église, Kowalski and his group were still moving. They had grown in number, again more scattered paratroopers joining them as the night continued. Some were wounded, some had lost their equipment, none of them had a clear chain of command, but they didn't need one. By now the pattern was clear: hit the roads, disrupt movement, disappear. Every successful ambush gave them confidence. Every explosion echoed farther into the countryside, reinforcing the illusion that a much larger force was operating in the area. At one point they came across a German motorcycle dispatch rider racing north. A single shot dropped him instantly. Kowalski grabbed the satchel slung across the man's shoulder. Inside were dispatch orders, movement instructions, unit positions, timings. Even without fully understanding the details, one thing was obvious. German forces were trying to reorganize, trying to respond. And they were already behind schedule. Keep hitting them, Kowalski said quietly, and they did. Another convoy, another ambush, another delay. Each time the Germans reacted the same way, sending more troops inland, pulling more resources away from the front. Farther north, a moment occurred that would have even greater impact. A German staff car sped down a narrow road, moving quickly without escort. Inside was a senior officer racing toward the coast, attempting to coordinate a response to the invasion reports. He never made it. A lone American paratrooper hidden in a ditch heard the engine approaching. He had one grenade left. He waited until the car was close, then threw it into the road. The explosion flipped the vehicle violently, sending it crashing into a tree. By the time the smoke cleared, both occupants were dead. One of them was a general, one of the few officers capable of organizing a coordinated defense in that sector. But the American who threw the grenade didn't know that. To him, it was just another target, another moment of survival, another decision made in the dark. This was the pattern of the entire night. Small actions, unplanned encounters, individual decisions made without full information, and yet together they created a chain reaction the Germans couldn't control. By 5:30 a.m., just before dawn, the consequences became clear. German units that should have been reinforcing the beaches were still miles inland. Some were stuck on damaged roads. Others were searching fields and villages for paratroopers who had already moved on. Communication between units was fragmented. Reports were delayed or inaccurate. Officers were forced to make decisions based on incomplete information. And worst of all, they still didn't know where the main attack was coming from. Because out at sea, the real invasion was already in motion. As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the Allied fleet approached the Normandy coast. Thousands of ships stretched across the water, carrying soldiers, tanks, and supplies. For the men inside the landing craft, this was the moment they had trained for. The moment everything depended on, but the German defenses waiting for them were not what they should have been. Positions were undermanned. Reinforcements were delayed. Artillery coordination was inconsistent, and in some areas entire units were missing, not because they had been destroyed, but because they had been sent inland to fight an enemy that didn't exist in the way they imagined. At Utah Beach, the difference was immediate. As the first waves approached the shore, resistance was lighter than expected. There was still gunfire, still danger, still chaos. But it wasn't the overwhelming defense planners had feared. The troops pushed forward, gaining ground faster than anticipated. Behind the lines, the confusion only deepened. German commanders began to realize something was wrong. The scale of the airborne threat didn't match what they were encountering. The scattered groups they were chasing didn't behave like a coordinated force. They struck quickly, then disappeared. They didn't hold ground. They didn't advance in formation. It didn't make sense. But by the time they started to question it, it was too late. Damage had already been done. The roads had been disrupted. The reinforcements had been delayed. An opportunity to mount a strong, coordinated defense was slipping away, and all of it traced back to a single moment, a single decision. A radio operator sitting in the dark, turning a dial to the wrong frequency. Back in England, Whitaker had already moved on. The mission was over. The plane had landed. The crew had debriefed. Reports were filed quickly, efficiently, without much attention. Signal acquired. Drop successful. No complications. It was just another mission among hundreds that night. No one questioned it. No one suspected anything was wrong. Because from the air, everything had looked perfect, but on the ground, perfection didn't exist, only chaos. And in that chaos, something unexpected had an advantage. An error had become a weapon, and an unplanned drop had changed the balance of the battle. The mistake that won the morning. By the time the sun fully rose over Normandy, the battle had already taken a direction no one had planned, but one that would change everything. Along the coastline, Allied forces were pushing inland. At Utah Beach, units that were expected to face overwhelming resistance were advancing faster than predicted. Roads that should have been flooded with German reinforcements remained partially empty, delayed, blocked, or misdirected. Behind the lines, confusion still lingered like a shadow the Germans couldn't shake. And scattered across the countryside, the paratroopers kept moving. Kowalski and his group hadn't slept, they hadn't stopped. The adrenaline had carried them through the night, but now exhaustion was setting in. Their uniforms were torn, their faces covered in dirt and smoke. Ammunition was running low. But they kept going, driven by one simple understanding: every minute they delayed the enemy meant more lives saved on the beaches. As the morning light revealed the damage, the scale of what had happened began to show. Burned-out trucks lined sections of road. Abandoned equipment lay scattered in fields. Communication wires hung cut and useless. German units were out of position, disorganized, trying to regroup after a night that made no sense to them. And this chill, they didn't fully understand, because how could they? How could a handful of scattered soldiers create this level of disruption? How could men with no orders, no coordination, and no clear objective slow down an entire defensive response? The answer was something no one had planned for. They weren't fighting like a structured army. They were fighting like shadows, everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Around mid-morning, Kowalski's group finally linked up with elements of a larger airborne unit pushing inland from the beaches. For the first time since the jump, there was structure, command, a clear picture of the situation. Officers quickly gathered reports from the scattered paratroopers, piecing together what had happened during the night. Ambushes on supply roads, convoys destroyed, units delayed, commanders cut off. At first it sounded exaggerated, almost impossible, but as more reports came in from different locations, from different groups, all telling the same story, the truth became undeniable. The scattered drops hadn't failed, they had worked in a completely unexpected way. Instead of concentrating their forces in one place, the airborne troops had spread chaos across the entire region. They had forced the Germans to react to dozens of small threats instead of one clear objective. They had turned confusion into a weapon, and it had worked. Hours later, as the battle for Normandy continued, the bigger picture became clear at the highest levels of command. German reinforcements that should have reached the beaches in the critical early hours were delayed. Some never arrived at all. Others arrived too late to make a difference. The window of opportunity those first few hours when the invasion could have been pushed back into the sea had slipped away, and once that moment was gone, it was gone forever. Back in England, reports from the operation were still being processed. Pilots debriefed, navigation logs reviewed, radio frequencies checked and recorded. It was routine. Standard procedure after a mission of that scale. That's when someone noticed it, a small detail, almost insignificant. The frequency used for one of the drop zones didn't match the planned signal. At first, it looked like a minor error, a simple mistake in navigation, something that happened in the chaos of night operations. But as analysts compared timelines, drop locations, and ground reports, a pattern began to emerge. That mistake had sent an entire group of paratroopers miles away from their intended target, right into the path of German supply routes, right into the exact area where the most disruption could be caused. It wasn't planned, it wasn't calculated, it wasn't even intentional. It had an impact no one could have predicted, the kind of impact that doesn't show up on maps or in orders, but changes the outcome of events in ways history only understands later. For the men on the ground, there were no grand realizations in that moment, no speeches, no sense of having changed the course of the war. There was only survival, movement, the next objective, the next fight. Kowalski never knew how important that first ambush had been. He never knew how many reinforcements it delayed. He never knew how many lives it may have saved. To him, it was just a decision made in the dark, a choice to act instead of wait. And like hundreds of other paratroopers scattered across Normandy that night, he simply did what he had to do. History, however, would see it differently, because sometimes war isn't decided by perfectly executed plans. Sometimes it turns on small moments, on unexpected outcomes, on mistakes, and on the people who choose to act when everything goes wrong. Night, a wrong signal scattered American paratroopers across the countryside. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it became an advantage, not because of strategy, not because of orders, but because of the men on the ground who turned confusion into opportunity. And in doing so, they helped win the morning.